The final test was held in the Emperor's private court. Unlike the previous challenges of wisdom and strength, this trial was not about physical skill. This was about power, influence, control. Jin Rui stood among the remaining candidates, her rivals reduced to only 3. Lady Shu Qing, a noblewoman known for her ability to twist words and manipulate others. General's daughter, Lin Yao, a strategist who had won favor through sheer intelligence. Princess Zhao Ying, ruthless, dangerous. Minister Jiang Wei stood before them, holding a sealed black scroll. "For this trial," he announced, "each of you will be given a secret. A piece of information that could ruin someone in this court." A murmur of anticipation rippled through the nobles. "This is not a test of truth," Jiang Wei continued. "This is a test of survival." Jin Rui's pulse quickened. They were being forced into a battle of deception. Each candidate would have 2 choices: use their secret to destroy an opponent, manipulate the court without losing their honor. Jin Rui accepted her scroll. She opened it, and her breath stilled. The secret given to her was about Prince Zhao Luan. Her heart thundered. The test had just become personal. One by one, the candidates made their moves. Lady Shu Qing exposed Lin Yao's secret, turning the court against her. Lin Yao retaliated, revealing a scandal within Shu Qing's house. The court was divided. The balance of power shifted. Then, it was Jin Rui's turn. All eyes turned to her. She stepped forward, holding her sealed scroll. A moment of silence. Then she raised her gaze. "I refuse," gasps. The Emperor's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Explain." Jin Rui met his gaze without fear. "A ruler is not made by tearing others down," she said. "A ruler is made by knowing when to act and when to withhold power." She let her scroll drop. It landed untouched on the marble floor. Silence. Then, Minister Jiang smirked. "She is past." The Emperor's expression remained unreadable, but Jin Rui could tell. She had won. Duke Ren and concubine Mei Lin had lost too many battles. The court was turning against them, and Jin Rui was rising too quickly. So they did what desperate people do. They tried to eliminate her once and for all. One night, Rui had just left the palace corridors when a cold wind rushed past her. Then, a flicker of steel. An assassin. She barely twisted in time to avoid the blade. The attacker lunged, but he had made a fatal mistake. Jin Rui was not alone. Zhao Luan's sword was already drawn, and within seconds, the assassin lay dead at her feet. A shocked silence. Then, a second mistake. The assassin had a letter. Jin Rui bent down, plucking the parchment from his robes. She opened it and smiled, because the seal on the letter belonged to Duke Ren. The next morning, the court erupted into chaos. The assassin's letter was presented before the Emperor. Duke Ren and concubine Mei Lin tried to deny it, but it was too late. The Emperor's gaze darkened. "You have betrayed me," he said. Duke Ren fell to his knees. "Your Majesty, I was deceived." Silence. The Emperor turned to the guards. "Take them away." And just like that, they were finished. Jin Rui stood among the nobles, watching as her greatest enemies were dragged from the court. She had won, but the game was not over yet. Later that night, Zhao Luan found her again. But this time, he was not calm. "You almost died." His voice was low, furious. Jin Rui exhaled. "But I didn't." Zhao Luan's jaw clenched. "You fight alone," he murmured, "and I am forced to stand back while they come for you." His fist tightened. "I am tired of waiting in the shadows." Jin Rui's heart ached. She reached forward, her fingers brushing against his hand. "You trust me, don't you?" Zhao Luan exhaled sharply. Then he turned. his voice strained. For now. And for the first time, Jin Rui felt afraid, because Zhao Luan was a prince, and if she could not stop him from acting recklessly, he might do something he could never take back. The court holds its breath on the day of the final decision. The Golden Hall was silent. Jin Rui stood with the final candidates, their silken robes rustling as they knelt before the emperor. Minister Zhang Wei stood beside the throne, the imperial selection scroll open in his hands. The trials had ended. The challenges were over. Now, only one would be chosen. The emperor leaned forward on his throne, surveying the remaining contenders. His gaze landed on Jin Rui. He had tested her, pushed her, forced her to prove that she was not just an outsider, but a true force in his court. And she had. After a long pause, he spoke. Jin Rui's heart thundered. You have demonstrated intelligence, strength, and wisdom, the emperor continued. You have outplayed nobles, strategists, and warriors alike. A beat of silence. Rise. Jin Rui slowly stood, her face calm, but her pulse racing. The emperor's next words would seal her fate. Then, he spoke. You shall be my son's bride. The court erupted in whispers. Jin Rui's fingers curled into her sleeves. She had won. And yet, she glanced at Zhao Luan, and for the first time, she saw conflict in his eyes. Something was wrong. That night, Zhao Luan found her. His expression was tense, unreadable. You've won, he said. Jin Rui exhaled. So why do you look like I've lost? Zhao Luan stepped forward, grabbing her hands. Because you think this is over, he whispered. But it's not. Jin Rui's breath hitched. He was serious. I am done playing by my father's rules, he murmured. Jin Rui's heart pounded. Zhao Luan, what are you saying? He hesitated. Then, he reached into his sleeve and pulled out a jade seal. Jin Rui's blood ran cold. That was his princely insignia, and it was missing its ribbon, which meant, you're going to renounce your title, she realized. Zhao Luan exhaled sharply. I will leave the palace. I will leave everything behind. Jin Rui staggered back. This is treason, she whispered. Zhao Luan's jaw clenched. Then come with me. Jin Rui's pulse thundered. He was serious. If he left the palace without permission, he would be declared a traitor. He would be exiled, or worse, hunted down. She shook her head. You cannot do this, she whispered. Zhao Luan reached for her again. You don't belong here, Jin Rui, he murmured. We can be free. Jin Rui's chest tightened. She had spent her whole life surviving, playing this game, fighting for her place, and now, the one person she trusted most was asking her to walk away. Tears stung in her eyes. She loved him, but she could not let him destroy himself. She forced herself to say it. I cannot. Zhao Luan's breath hitched. Jin Rui lifted her chin, her voice unwavering. I did not fight this long just to run away. A beat of silence. Then, Zhao Luan's expression shattered. I should have known, he whispered. His hands slowly fell from hers. Jin Rui swallowed past the ache in her throat. This is bigger than us, she said softly. Zhao Luan exhaled sharply. Then I wish you well, he said, his voice strained. He stepped back. For the first time, he did not reach for her again. Then, he turned and left, and Jin Rui was left alone, with a crown she had earned, and a heart that was breaking. The palace glowed with golden banners, embroidered with the imperial dragon. Servants bustled around, preparing for the wedding of the year. Jin Rui sat in the Phoenix Pavilion, where the future brides of the imperial family were traditionally housed before their weddings. Her silk robes were woven with gold threads. Her hair had been arranged in the intricate 9-pin coronet, a symbol of her new status. She should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt empty. Zhao Luan had not spoken to her since that night, and though she told herself she had done the right thing, a part of her felt like she had lost something she could never regain. Minister Jiang Wei visited her before the wedding. He studied her for a long moment before speaking. "You have won," he said, "but do you understand what comes next?" Jin Rui lifted her chin. "The Emperor's court is a battlefield. I know that better than anyone." Jiang Wei smiled. "Then you know your greatest battle is yet to come." He paused. Then his next words made her blood run cold. "Because the Emperor does not intend for you to simply be Zhao Luan's wife," he said. "He intends for you to rule." Jin Rui stilled. The Emperor had chosen her, not just as a bride, but as his successor's greatest weapon. And that meant one thing: she would never be safe. In the halls of the palace, a man walked in silence. His robes were midnight blue, lined with silver embroidery, the mark of the Imperial Chancellor, Han Xian. Unlike Duke Ren, he did not rely on arrogance or reckless ambition. He was patient, cold, calculating, and he had been watching Jin Rui long before Duke Ren and Mei Lin fell. Now he stepped into the light. That evening, Jin Rui was summoned to a private audience. When she arrived, Han Xian was already seated, sipping tea with an elegant precision that made her uneasy. "Lady Jin Rui," he murmured, "or should I say, the future Empress." Jin Rui lowered herself into a bow, but did not lower her gaze. "You wish to see me, Chancellor?" Han Xian smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "You have eliminated your enemies well," he said, "but I wonder, do you know what you have become?" Jin Rui's fingers tightened in her sleeves. "You have made powerful allies," Han Xian continued, "but you have also made powerful enemies. The Emperor favors you now, but emperors are not immortal." A warning, a threat. Jin Rui kept her voice even. "Then I shall have to be prepared, won't I?" Han Xian's smirk deepened. "Indeed," he murmured. Then he placed a scroll on the table between them. "Inside this," he said softly, "is a record of every noble house that does not support your marriage, every ally you lack." Jin Rui's breath stilled. He was giving her information. But why? Han Xian leaned forward. "If you wish to survive, Lady Jin Rui, you will need a real ally." A pause. Then he said the words that shook her to her core. "Marry me instead." Jin Rui did not hesitate to answer. Prince Zhao Luan had spent his entire life in a golden cage. But when Jin Rui refused to leave with him, something inside him broke. He could not sit back and watch. He could not accept this fate. So, he made a decision. It began as a rumor, whispers spreading through the palace. The second prince had disappeared. Jin Rui had just returned from her meeting with Han Xian when Minister Zhang stormed into her chambers. "Your prince has lost his mind," he said sharply. Jin Rui's breath caught. What happened? Zhang Wei's gaze hardened. He has challenged his own brother to a duel. Jin Rui's stomach dropped. The first prince, Zhao Wenji, the emperor's favored heir. A ruthless commander who had spent his entire life in battle. And Zhao Luan had just challenged him. Jin Rui ran. Through the palace corridors, through the gardens. She reached the private dueling grounds, just as Zhao Luan and Zhao Wenji stood facing each other. Swords drawn. The moon shone against the silver of their blades. Jin Rui did not hesitate. She stepped between them, her arms outstretched. "Enough," she commanded. Zhao Luan's chest rose and fell rapidly, his grip tight around his sword. "Jin Rui, move." "No," she said firmly. Zhao Wenji, his face calm and unreadable, lowered his sword. "You should listen to her, brother," he said, "because if we fight, I will not hold back." Zhao Luan's jaw clenched. Jin Rui turned to him. "You think this will change anything?" she whispered. His breath was ragged. "It changes everything," he said. Jin Rui's heart ached. She lowered her voice. "Then let me change it with you." A heavy silence. Then, Zhao Luan exhaled sharply. He let his sword fall from his fingers. Jin Rui caught it before it hit the ground. Han Xian's words still echoed in the chamber. "Marry me instead." Jin Rui did not hesitate. "No." The Chancellor's expression remained unreadable, but she saw it, the brief flicker of surprise. "You reject an alliance that could protect you," he murmured, swirling his cup of tea. "Bold." Jin Rui lifted her chin. "I do not need your protection." Han Xian chuckled softly. "Perhaps not today," he mused. "But power shifts like the tide, Lady Jin Rui. You would do well to remember that." He stood, his movements slow and deliberate. Then, he said something that sent a chill through her bones. "The difference between you and me," he murmured, "is that I have never lost." Jin Rui did not flinch, but as Han Xian walked away, she knew. She had just made a true enemy, and this one was worse than any before. The next morning, the imperial court gathered. Zhao Luan knelt before his father, his wrists bound in red silk, a symbol of royal disgrace. The emperor sat high upon his jade throne, his expression cold, unreadable. "You have dishonored this court," he said, his voice calm but sharp. Zhao Luan did not bow his head. "I take full responsibility," he said. The nobles whispered. The emperor exhaled, leaning forward. "Then you know the punishment for treason." Jin Rui's heart pounded. This was it. If she did not act now, Zhao Luan would be exiled. Or worse, she could not allow that. She stepped forward, her silk robes whispering against the polished floor. The court stilled. She lowered herself onto her knees. "Your Majesty," she said, "if punishment must be given, let it fall upon me instead." A sharp gasp. Zhao Luan's head snapped toward her. The emperor's gaze darkened. "You would take the fall for him?" he asked, his tone laced with amusement. Jin Rui's voice did not waver. "A ruler does not rise alone," she said. "They rise with those who believe in them." She bowed deeply. "If Zhao Luan must be punished, let his punishment be to serve the empire. Let him prove his worth instead of being cast aside." A long silence. The emperor studied her. Then, he chuckled. "You always were too clever," he murmured. Then, he turned to Zhao Luan. "You will not be exiled," he decreed. "Instead, you will be sent to the northern border to command our troops. If you wish to prove your loyalty, do so in war." Zhao Luan stiffened. A battlefield. Not exile, but a different kind of danger. Jin Rui's fingers curled into her sleeves. It was not what she wanted, but it was better than losing him forever. That night, Jin Rui stood in the imperial garden, staring at the moon's reflection in the still waters of the lotus pond. She had won. She had secured her position, but at what cost? Footsteps sounded behind her. She turned, and there was Minister Jiang Wei. He studied her for a long moment. Then he spoke. "You saved him today." Jin Rui did not answer. Jiang Wei smirked. "But I wonder, who will save you?" She finally met his gaze. "I do not need saving." Jiang Wei hummed. "Then tell me," he said, "what will you do next?" Jin Rui exhaled slowly. She had been fighting for so long, surviving, adapting, winning. But was survival enough? No. She had come this far. She would not stop here. She lifted her gaze. "I will fight," she said softly. Jiang Wei smiled. Then he bowed slightly. Then let us see what kind of empress you become. The imperial court had changed. Jin Rui was no longer an outsider, no longer fighting for a place. She had won. But with victory came war. She now sat beside the emperor in council, listening as generals, ministers, and noble lords debated the empire's future. She was watched by many eyes, some full of admiration, others full of hate. And one gaze, in particular, burned with vengeance. Han Xian, the man she had rejected, the man she had made her enemy. He had not made a move yet, but she knew it was coming. And when it did, she would be ready. It happened during a banquet. The court was gathered in the Golden Lotus Hall, the air thick with the scent of incense and roasted meats. Jin Rui sat beside the emperor, her golden robes gleaming under the lanterns. And then, her cup was filled. She watched as a servant poured the wine, his hand steady. But she saw it. A single drop of liquid, colorless, scentless, disappearing into her drink. A poisoned cup. Jin Rui did not move. She did not react. Instead, she lifted the cup and handed it to Han Xian. A beat of silence, a flicker of shock in his eyes. But he recovered quickly, forcing a smile. "My lady honors me," he said, lifting the cup. A pause. Then, he drank. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, his hand clenched around the cup. His breath hitched. His face turned pale. The court stilled. Jin Rui leaned forward, her voice soft, deadly. "You should have used a better poison." Han Xian collapsed to his knees. The emperor stood abruptly. "Summon the physicians!" a minister shouted. But it was too late. The poison was already in his veins. Han Xian was dragged from the hall, his body racked with pain. And Jin Rui? She simply took another cup of wine, one that was untainted, and she drank it. Because Han Xian had never stood a chance. The northern border was a land of ice and steel. Zhao Luan had spent weeks in battle, leading his forces against the invading armies. The war was fierce, brutal, and yet, through the blood and chaos, he found clarity. He had tried to leave Jin Rui, tried to let her go, but he could not. One night, as Zhao Luan's forces raided an enemy stronghold, he discovered something shocking: secret letters. Letters written in familiar handwriting. And when he saw the name of the sender, his blood turned to ice. It was a noble from the imperial court, someone still in power, someone who was working against the emperor. Zhao Luan grabbed the letters. He had the proof, and now he had a reason to return, to protect Jin Rui, to change the fate of the empire. Zhao Luan did not stop to rest. He rode through the night, through the rain and wind. He reached the imperial palace at dawn. The guards tried to halt him. He ignored them. Storming into the golden hall, covered in dust and blood, he threw the letters before the emperor. "Read them," he commanded. A moment of silence. Then, the emperor picked up the first scroll. His expression darkened. Jin Rui stepped forward, her heart pounding. "What is this?" she asked. Zhao Luan turned to her. His gaze burned. "The real enemy," he said. "The one we never saw." Jin Rui stilled. Because the name written on the letters, the traitor hiding in plain sight, was someone far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. Jin Rui's fingers tightened around the scroll. Zhao Luan had returned from the battlefield not just for her, but for this. For justice. For the empire. The name written in the secret letters was one no one had expected. The emperor's closest advisor, Grand Minister Wei, a man who had served the empire for decades, a man who had stood beside the emperor through wars, rebellions, and betrayals. And yet, He had been the greatest traitor of all. Minister Wei did not deny the accusations. He simply smiled. "You are all fools," he murmured. The court gasped. "The emperor is old," Wei continued, his voice calm and controlled. "He is blind to the rot within his own walls. I only sought to ensure the empire's survival." Jin Rui stepped forward, her voice like steel. "You sought to ensure your own power." Minister Wei laughed softly. "And what of you, Lady Jin Rui?" he said, tilting his head. "You are no different than me." The court tensed. Jin Rui's gaze did not waver. "I do not betray the people I claim to serve," she said coldly. The emperor finally spoke. "You have betrayed me," he said, his voice calm but final. He turned to the guards. "Take him away." Minister Wei's expression remained unchanged. As he was dragged from the court, he turned to Jin Rui one last time. "You have won this battle," he murmured. Then he smiled. "But the empire is far from saved." His words lingered, and Jin Rui knew this was not over. Not yet. Minister Wei's fall shook the empire, but his influence had spread too far. Nobles whispered in shadowed corridors. Generals questioned their loyalty. Everyone was watching, waiting, because the emperor was growing weaker, and the question on everyone's lips was the same. Who would rule when he was gone? Jin Rui felt the weight of their stares. She was the future empress, but not yet. Until the emperor's final decree, she was still just a woman in the court. And in this war, even a future empress could be destroyed. One night, Jin Rui awoke to the sound of steel. She moved instinctively, rolling from her bed as a blade slashed down where she had been sleeping. A second assassin lunged. Jin Rui caught the dagger's hilt, twisting it from the attacker's grasp. Before she could strike, the doors burst open. Zhao Luan was there, sword in hand, face furious. In a single stroke, he cut down the assassin before they could react. The second attacker tried to flee, but Jin Rui threw the dagger, pinning them to the wall. Silence. Blood pooled across the floor. Zhao Luan's breathing was heavy. Then he turned to her. His voice was tight with anger. "They will never stop." Jin Rui exhaled slowly. "No," she said, "they won't. Because this was a war, and wars were not won by waiting. They were won by striking first." Days later, the emperor called for them. His voice was weaker than before. He knew his time was ending. Jin Rui knelt beside him, silent. For all his power, the emperor was still just a man. And as he looked at her, she saw understanding in his gaze. "Are you ready?" he asked. Jin Rui's breath stilled. Then she nodded. "Yes." The emperor exhaled slowly. Then he turned to Zhao Luan. "Protect her." Zhao Luan's jaw tightened. And then the decree was made. Jin Rui would rule. Not as a puppet, not as a consort, but as empress. The court roared, some in outrage, some in loyalty. It did not matter, because in the end, they had won. Together, they had shattered every expectation, broken every tradition, and claimed the empire itself. And as Jin Rui stood beside Zhao Luan, wearing the golden crown of an empress, she finally understood. She had never been meant to survive. She had been meant to rule. And now, she would. The golden crown sat heavy on her head, the weight of an empire. Jin Rui stood on the high balcony of the palace, overlooking the vast capital that now belonged to her. Below, the people had gathered, thousands of them, a sea of faces stretching beyond the palace gates. Some watched in awed silence. Others whispered. A few still clung to their doubt. But none could deny the truth. She had won, not through birthright, not through submission. She had fought, outmaneuvered, and survived every trap, every betrayal. And now, the empire bowed before her. A shift in the air. She did not need to turn to know who had stepped beside her. Zhao Luan. He said nothing for a long moment, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze on the city below. Then, softly, "Are you ready?" Jin Rui let out a slow breath. The court still held enemies who would seek to tear her down. The empire was vast, and war still threatened its borders. The throne she had claimed was not a place of comfort, but a battlefield. But she had never fought to be comfortable. She fought to win. Her golden eyes gleamed. "I was born ready." Zhao Luan smirked. Then, with quiet amusement, "Then let them come." She turned, facing him fully. "Let them try." And as the banners of the empire fluttered in the wind, the dawn of Empress Jin Rui's reign began. The end.